Hello there, good to see you again. Well done for loading this one up. You've watched 2 videos at least already. You've listened to my voice quite a lot. Promise you this is going to be much shorter, much snappier. And before you know it, you'll be done. You'll be inspired and ready to come to Southwold to collect your fieldwork data. So this is virtual video 4, titled Collecting Data and Designing Your Study. Again, one of the things that I'd suggest that you do is to grab your electronic or hard copy of this booklet. There's a few things in here, particularly the back 2 pages that I'm going to refer to during this final presentation. Okay, just briefly referring to this slide once again. As I said, this is the final video of 4, probably 3 that you've watched. You've now got a good understanding about the geography of Southwold, hopefully, and also the types of things that you can measure within the town. So this final one is all about you then actually getting prepared for your visit and coming to Southwold with a plan of action, knowing exactly what you're going to do, where you're going to go, and making you feel confident about the study that you ultimately choose to complete. Right, so in your booklet, you'll have a couple of pages that look like this. The page on the right, don't worry too much about at the moment, but the page on the left is basically a summary of what this presentation is all about. And the onus really at this stage is on you designing your days in Southwold. So thinking about what it actually is that you do and how you do it when you come to Southwold, because actually we're not going to tell you, and nor are your teachers. And this is a little bit daunting, or it can be a bit daunting, but ultimately you're going to be driven to Southwold. You're going to be able to collect bits of equipment that you might need from us, and you're obviously going to be able to ask us questions and things like that. But when it comes down to it, it's going to be you who decides what field work to do and also where to do that field work. There's no good really you turning up without a plan and just kind of willy-nilly going off into Southwold collecting bits of data without any real kind of coherent plan as to why you're doing that or what you're doing. So this is basically where you get thinking about your plan of attack. What is it that you're going to do when you come to Southwold? How are you going to design your days so you're making the best use of your time? But also, how are you going to make sure that you're collecting relevant data, reliable data, and using things like sampling strategies and stuff like that? So that's what this page is kind of encouraging you to think about, how you actually go about designing your fieldwork. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about an S word that sometimes people forget when they think of fieldwork, but it's really important that you do consider it. So that S word is sampling, and it's something that you'll hear probably from your teachers, and if you look at mark schemes and things like that, this word sampling is used quite a lot when we're talking about fieldwork, and it's probably much more simple than we often perhaps give credit for. So sampling essentially is where you're thinking about taking a sample of the available information. So essentially, when you think about doing an investigation into something, to try and get a really valid and reliable investigation, obviously what you would try to do is to get lots and lots of information, because obviously the nature of doing any kind of investigation is the more information you can gather, the more reliable your results are. But obviously the kind of limitation that we have with any fieldwork trip is that you're not going to be able to collect all of the data that's available, because you're only going to be coming over 1 or 2 days. And you're not going to physically be able to go everywhere and do everything that you might want to in those 2 days. So any bits of data that you gather are literally just a selection or a sample of the general wider information that is available. So for instance, if you're doing a pedestrian count, you wouldn't do that for 48 hours to get the complete pedestrian count of Southwold over the 2 days that you visited. You'd probably only do it maybe over a combination of maybe 20 to 30 minutes perhaps. You certainly wouldn't do it for your whole time. So you're just getting a sample, a snippet of the available information. So all fieldwork, whether we're conscious of it or not, involves this thing called sampling. And as it says there, you will not be able to measure everything, just a selection or a sample of what is available. Now it's up to you then to be aware of this idea about sampling and kind of come up with a plan that's often referred to as your sampling strategy. So what are you going to do? How are you going to ensure the best use of your time and making sure you go to the right places, or maybe repeat surveys in different places get what's called a representative sample. So how are you going to get data that basically is a confident representation of what the general picture is for that location? So to do that, you have to consider a variety of different things. And that's what I'm going to try and do over the next few slides, is to kind of get you thinking about this idea of sampling and what type of steps and questions you might need to ask yourself at this kind of planning stage in terms of what you might need to do. Right, on the screen here then, we've got an example of a template of a study that's got a title. It's supported by 3 sub-questions, and the student has allocated 2 or 3 methods to each of those sub-questions. I think in total they've got 7 different methods that they're intending to do. And they've gone to their teacher, the teacher has given it the once-over and has kind of given it the green light and said, right, great, I think that's a study that will probably work. But they've then said to the student, right, you need to now think about collecting that data and how you're going to do it. What are your sampling strategies and what's the plan of action for you? So just to kind of give you an idea about what we mean by this, one of the things that I'd suggest that you do is you look at your methods when you're at this stage, and then you kind of reflect on how it is that you're actually going to complete those methods. So first of all, I've just taken as a kind of a random example out of those methods. One of the ones that the student is looking to do is groin height measurements, which we've spoken about in the coasts video. Don't worry at this stage if you're not doing a coastal study. This is still relevant to you because this is talking about how you can kind of consider what sampling you might need to do. So for this student that's doing groin height sampling, one of the things that they're obviously going to need to consider is how many of Southwold's groins are they going to actually gather data from. So you can see on the screen there's a picture of 8 wooden groins. You might not be able to see all 8 because some of those are completely swallowed by sand. And there's also 8 rock groins in the foreground as well. You can just see the edge of one of them over there. Now, a student, first of all, needs to make a decision about how many of those groins are they going to measure. That's not something that their teacher's going to tell them or that I'm going to tell you. It's something that you're going to have to decide. How many of those groins are you going to measure? Secondly, this is the one that you might instinctively be a bit confused about. How many points am I going to measure down each groin? So in the side of this screen here, we've got a picture, kind of like a landscape picture of one of the groins. Now, one of the methods that students are doing is trying to measure the amount of sand that is kind of accumulated against each side of the groin. Now, you might choose to do that just where that kind of cartoon lady has stood there and do that towards the top of the groin, but that wouldn't give you a representative sample of what was going on across the whole groin. So you'd probably be encouraged actually to measure at different points down that individual groin. It might be that you choose to measure within each of those different posts that you can see. It might be in total then that you measure at 8 points down that groin. One of the other things you could do is you could potentially measure the length of that groin. It might be 20 meters, for instance, and then divide that systematically into smaller chunks. So you might measure at 5-meter intervals down that groin. Or you might measure the length of the groin, use a random number calculator on your phone and actually come up with 5 points along that groin to measure the difference on each side. So one of the things that you'll need to think about is this, how many measurements am I going to take? And for this then, you might then be considering different sampling methods. So for this method here of groin measurements, one of the things that I'd suggest that you consider are these methods that are on the screen now. So we've got 3 methods of sampling that might be relevant. Random sampling, like I said, is where you have a kind of a total number. So it might be here that we've got a total of 20 meters. And you might use a random number generator to select maybe 5 sites within that 20-meter range for you to do those groin height measurements. There are pros and cons to that, which you can probably think of straight away. Systematic approach is where you measure the distance and you divide it into equal intervals. Again, there are pros and cons to that approach. The third one that I've got on the screen is probably one that's less known about, this kind of opportunistic sampling method, which is probably the most appropriate one to use on the groin here. Now, opportunistic is where you have got the freedom really to move your sampling points to places that are appropriate and where access is good. So for instance, if you systematically or chose to systematically sample along this groin here, Your first 5 metre reading might be fine, and it might be that that is a measurement up to the top of one of those horizontal beams. Your 10 metre reading might also be up to one of the tops of those horizontal beams. But the third reading at 15 metres might actually correspond with where one of those posts are. So it actually wouldn't be appropriate for you to measure there. It would actually be better for you to move your measurement either up a little bit or down a little bit down that groin, so you had a consistent measurement to the top of the horizontal beam. And that's what we'd call opportunistic. It's where you have more of an opportunity to move your sampling site to a place which is more appropriate, or maybe where the access is better. So you need to think about what sampling technique for some of your methods you're going to use, not just how much of a sample you're going to gather, but what sampling technique might be used. The other thing that's also important to consider, particularly with coastal studies, and will be the case with some of the human ones as well, is when you look at your methods, you should be thinking, when I gather that data, is that data going to be fixed, or is it going to change over the course of the day or the days that I'm visiting? And do I potentially need to repeat it to enhance the reliability of this result? So, for instance, one that comes to mind is the orange drift test that this student is intending to do. If you threw the orange into the sea here, that orange is going to move and it's going to drift in one direction or the other. Now, the strength of that drift is going to change over the course of the day or the time that you are in Southwold. So actually, to get more reliable results, the sampling of this orange drift test needs to be done more than once. It needs to be done perhaps multiple times, and that would enable you to get a more reliable result. Things like footfall surveys, pedestrian counts, age surveys, human studies, those are things that also are likely to vary during the time that you're here. So you might need to think about which data that you're going to collect is going to be set, that requires you really only to do it once, and which data that you're going to collect is going to be variable, that would perhaps mean that you might need to gather it more than once. Okay, just going to introduce a couple of other sampling strategies that you might want to consider. And again, just referring back to this plan of a NEA that a student has got here on the screen. Going to highlight a method here, which a number of you may choose to do, of questionnaires or interviews. And I think I've mentioned this before, but very often when students are doing questionnaires, they'll ask us or they'll ask their teacher, how many questionnaires do I need to do? Well, there are certain documents that say you should do 50, there's others that say you should do 25. In my opinion, doing any questionnaire is a bonus. And even if you've only done 1 or 2, that might not be a massive sample, obviously, but any information that you can get from the public about your issue and your investigation is a bonus, and you should use it, regardless of how little or how much you've got. So there are some days where the weather just isn't beneficial to doing questionnaires. If it's really wet or if it's really cold, it's very difficult to get plenty of questionnaires. But if you've only got 6, should you not include them? I think you should definitely include them. So any information that you can gather, no matter how small it is, from members of the public, I would definitely include in your NEA. And I've said I think on both video 2 and 3 that if you can kind of pluck up the courage to talk to members of the public or business owners, it can only be beneficial and it can support most studies. So I don't think there's an answer to that one. How many is enough? More the merrier, really. The more information you can get, the better. And can you use a sampling method for questionnaires? Well, yeah, absolutely you can. On the screen here are 3 different types of sampling methods that you might want to consider in terms of doing questionnaires. So the first one that most people normally end up doing is sampling through a convenience method. Now, convenience basically means that you questionnaire anyone who's willing to stop and anyone who's willing to talk to you. And you haven't really got any kind of strict guidance about who it is that you speak to, what age category it is, where it is, whether they're locals or tourists or whatever. If anyone's willing to speak to you and answer your questions, then that would be classed as a convenience method of questionnaires. And obviously, through that method, you're likely to get more success. You're likely to get more people that are answering your questions. You might design a questionnaire that's maybe the first question is, are you a local or are you a tourist? And depending on their answer, you might then choose to ask them different questions based on that first answer. But a convenience method is one that is most likely to get you most people engaging with. The proportionate one takes a little bit more preparation and will probably inevitably result in you getting less people answering your questionnaires, but the proportionate one is where you try to have a fair representation of different kind of categories of people. So it might be that you're going to ask 20 locals and 20 tourists, or you're going to ask 10 people under the age of 50 and 10 people over the age of 50. So you kind of have this fair representation of different groups of people. Now that's possible to do that, but like I say, it's probably likely that that will result in you perhaps getting slightly less people responding to your questions than if you used the convenience approach. The expert one, the reason that I've got that on there is that the expert questionnaire sampling technique actually refers to this idea of speaking directly to the people that you know are going to have the most information about your issue, and not worrying too much about the quantity of information or the quantity of people that you speak to, but actually the quality of the information that you're getting by speaking to the people who are most informed about that. So on the screen there, for instance, the guy on the left-hand side is an owner of a cafe in Southwold, and therefore he's going to be an expert on certain matters within Southwold because he lives there, he works there, and he's got his finger on a pulse in terms of the local issues. And actually the information that he's likely to give you is actually going to probably be more valuable than the information that you might get from speaking to a number of tourists who may be much less well informed about the town and the issues that it faces. So actually, it might be that you only speak to 2 experts rather than doing a questionnaire of 20 people, and your expert questionnaire is actually more valid because it's got better knowledgeable information than maybe a questionnaire just generally of the members of the public. So you might need to think about what angle you go down in terms of speaking to the public, but those are a couple of sampling methods that you might want to consider. I've mentioned this on both of the videos that we've done previously, that speaking to members of the public is sometimes a bit challenging, and perhaps in a town where we've got older people as well in Southwold, and they're perhaps less used to speaking to younger people, or maybe there's a bit of a kind of a COVID legacy of maybe not wanting to speak to young people who've come out of COVID hotspots like schools. It might be that some of you struggle to engage with and maybe even have the confidence to speak to some people within Southwold. So if that's the case, you could still actually access information from people, just not doing it one-to-one on a kind of a questionnaire basis. You could obviously set up an online survey, SurveyMonkey, Google Forms, anything like that, and you could potentially post that on an online forum. There are a number of Southwold forums. There's ones on nextdoor.com, there's ones on Facebook. You could potentially post it under a hashtag on Twitter as well. You could maybe physically post it to Southwold's Town Council and ask them to put it on a notice board outside their offices in the High Street. There are a number of ways in which potentially you could actually survey members of the public without physically standing in front of them and approaching them. So think about, again, how you might design a question. Another thing that you'll need to consider, which is going to be your decision and entirely up to you, we won't guide you or kind of help you with this, is things to do with frequencies and timings. So by that, we mean how long are you going to time for on certain surveys, and how often are you going to repeat things. So again, looking at this study that this student has developed, looking at that method, the orange drift test, where they're going to throw an orange into the sea and look at the strength of longshore drift along different parts of the coastline. One of the things they might ask us naturally is, how long do we do this for? And that's going to be up to them to decide. If you do it maybe for 20 minutes, I'd perhaps say that's a bit long and you might get a bit bored. Most students tend to do it for 2 or 3 minutes, but that will be up to you to decide how long you do your surveys for, your comparative footfall surveys, maybe your age surveys, pedestrian counts, vehicle surveys, things like that. It's up to you how long you choose to count for and time for those things. It's also going to be up to you whether you consider that information to be variable and whether it will be a good idea to repeat that count at perhaps another time during a day, or maybe at another time during your visit if you're coming over 2 days. So that again is going to be your decision. There are going to be things that will influence some of the data that you get. It might be that actually things like lunch times will influence how busy certain parts of Southwold are. The streets and the prom, for instance, the high street and the prom might get busier during lunchtime. If you're doing a comparison survey, for instance, of cafes, and you've done a footfall survey at 11 o'clock outside the independent cafes, and then at 1 o'clock you do a footfall survey outside the chain cafes, then that's probably going to influence the accuracy of your results. So again, you want to perhaps try and synchronize that and consider that when you're designing your itinerary for the day. There are going to be things like the weather that will affect certain results that you get, like perhaps mood meter readings, environmental quality readings. Things like decibel counts will vary depending on the time of day and when certain places have deliveries. The other thing in Southwold, if you're doing coastal studies as well, that will influence some of your results, will be the tides. And I'll talk to you about this when you arrive, but there is generally a kind of what's called a slack period of tide, about an hour either side of the high and low tide. So you have a kind of this 2-hour period either side, an hour period either side of high and low tide, where the tidal currents are significantly less, and the tide has less influence over the longshore drift and the movement of material in the sea. So you might want to do your orange drift tests not within the hour either before or after high or low tide, if that makes sense. I'll speak a bit more about that on the next slide. But there are certain things that will influence the accuracy of your results, and that's again one of the things that you'll need to consider when you're planning your methodologies. This might not necessarily be something that you would naturally consider, but it's something that you definitely will want to consider because there are marks available for this when it comes to actually writing up your NEAs. So this is something called ethical considerations. And ethical considerations refer to how you can try and reduce essentially the impact of your fieldwork, how you can reduce the impact on people that you may engage with, or how you can ensure that there's no negative impact on the environment in which you're working with. So again, one of the things that you'll probably want to do is to consider the methods that you're intending to complete in Southwold and think about, on those methods, what ethical elements are there to them that may have a negative impact on people or the environment, and how can I take steps to reduce those? So I've highlighted pretty much all of those methods in the grid here on the left-hand side. The first one, annotated photos of sea defences. Well, you can do all sorts of photographs while you're in Southwold, some I'm sure with your own phone, some perhaps using our drone. And one of the things that you can do to reduce the ethical impact of your fieldwork is to ensure that the photographs that you include try not to include people's faces, or maybe don't include children, for instance. Or if you're including people within those photographs, that you don't do close-up to those people, but you do them from far enough away so they've got, a bit of anonymity. What's the word there that I'm looking for? I'm trying to think of it. But so people can still remain anonymous. So yeah, taking photographs, you just have to be a little bit careful about how you do it. If you're taking photographs of people's houses, making sure again that you do it at a sensitive distance, so that you're not literally getting people sunbathing in their gardens, but you're actually getting a photograph which is sympathetic to people that may be within them. So you might think a lot of this is common sense. A lot of it is common sense, but as I say, because there are marks available for this, you really want to kind of flag that you've considered this, and you spell it out, maybe even as a whole section in your NEA, the ethical considerations that you undertook, because that will make it really easy for whoever's marking your NEA to give you credit for it, give you these marks. Things like the groin height measurements, we've had issues in the past, particularly in the summer, where the groins they tend to be the type of objects that people like to have their picnics up against. So if you've got a nice sunny day in the summer, you often actually find people sunbathing propped up against the groins. And then if all of a sudden you arrive on the beach with your measuring sticks and your clipboards and you systematically are trying to sample down that groin, that will have a negative impact on people's experience. So what you might then choose to do is to return to that groin at a later point when it's available. So literally making a note of any of these considerations are going to help you later on when it comes to writing this up and getting credit for steps that you took to reduce your impact. Hopefully a number of you will be interested in taking aerial pictures, particularly if you're doing coastal studies. One of the things that I kind of stipulate when people are using a drone is that our main rule really is that when we're using a drone that we don't fly it over the land. And also, we obviously don't fly over people's houses and take photographs close to people's houses so we can see into their gardens and private spaces and things like that. But in terms of flying over the sea, that has much less visible impact on people, but also the sound that a drone makes often really annoys people. So we tend to take it off on the seafront and normally away from people, so at the far end of the pier car park, and then I instruct people to fly it straight out across the sea and then up, so it reduces the impact that it has on people immediately. People can't hear it, they can't see it, and you're only getting pictures that are taken far enough away, like this one on the screen here, that doesn't kind of, doesn't pick out anyone's faces or anyone's kind of personal property or anything like that. So we're a little bit sensitive about how we use the drone as well. In terms of questionnaires and interviews, you'd need to consider, perhaps, how you approach people, where you approach people, but also the types of questions that you're asking, not asking any kind of sensitive questions. Don't ask people things like their age, their kind of sexual orientation, even things like ethnicity. You don't probably need to get into those kind of personal questions, and avoiding that is, a step that you can take to reduce the impact that your fieldwork would have on people. So there's a number of things that you consider, and as I say, there are marks available for these ethical considerations. It's worth making a note of them while you're doing your fieldwork, and perhaps even beforehand. Probably one of the most boring aspects of fieldwork are risk assessments. If you ask any teachers as well, one of the most annoying things about doing any trips, probably the paperwork that they have to complete before they go out, and doing a risk assessment is one of those things. Now, there's no expectation really that you need to complete a risk assessment, a detailed document, before you do your fieldwork, but actually maybe having a small section in your NEA where you perhaps highlight any potential risks that might be associated with your fieldwork is not a bad idea, because it shows good planning. Now, particularly for those of you that are doing coastal fieldwork, one of the things I would definitely suggest that you do consider before your trip are the tides, because as you can see from this aerial view here of Southwold's beach, there are parts of Southwold's beach where the beach is less wide, and at certain times during the day and during the different states of the tide, the sea will actually come right in towards Southwold seawall, and you can see, looking at the pier there in the distance, the beach there is very narrow, and actually beyond the pier there's hardly any beach at all. And that's a photograph which has been taken at high tide, and when that tide recedes at low tide, there'll be more of the beach accessible. So one of the things that you'll need to be aware of when you're doing coastal fieldwork are the states of the tide on the day. So generally, we use a website called Tides for Fishing because it's free, and you can go onto that website, type in the name of the beach. So there's a search bar on there. We can type in Southwold. You have to scroll down a little bit, but eventually you will see that there is a line graph there that represents the state of the tide on any given day in the future. So select the right day, obviously, and then you'd look at that graph and you'd be able to work out then when high tide is and when low tide is. And for you guys, I would suggest then that if it's at high tide or during high tide, you work at the more southern end of the beach, towards the Dean's End and towards the Gun Hill end of the beach. And then at low tide, you make your way towards the pier and you're working at that more northern part of the beach, and perhaps even the North Beach beyond the pier as well. So it's going to be important for you guys to be aware of the state of the tide on the day. For those of you doing human investigations, the main kind of health and safety thing that you need to consider, which is kind of beyond your control, is obviously the weather, and things like that on the day. We'll obviously be aware of it too. And we'll instruct you where there are suitable places for you to take cover and shelter if there are deluges of rainstorms and things like that. But again, being aware of those things and just making a note of things like, I was aware of the tides on the day, I was aware of the state of the weather on the day, and I use this app, etc., to kind of keep abreast of that. Those are ways in which you're showing good planning, and those are things that will give you credit when it comes to kind of ticking off that box for the health and safety of your fieldwork. Now then, some of you will have a pretty good idea about what GIS is all about. It's something that modern human geography is all over, and is taught a lot about at university. There's actually specific degrees in GIS nowadays at many universities. Now, if you've got an understanding of GIS and you've been exposed to what's called Arcgis, then you probably don't need to watch this next bit, and you can probably skip through. But some of you probably haven't. And some of you might have heard of GIS, maybe had a little play around with it, but don't feel confident with it. If that's you, then kind of hold tight and just listen to this next bit, because one of the things that I did in both of the human and coastal fieldwork videos was I presented quite a few bits of data on maps. And you can actually do that with the data that you gather, but at the moment you've probably got no idea how you do that. One of the reasons that I'm going to show you and spend a little bit of time discussing this thing called GIS, it's because ultimately, when you've come to Southwold and you've got all of this data, you've got to think about what you do with it and how you present it. And traditionally, when you've done geography studies and perhaps when you've looked at various kind of questions on geography in exams, you often get graphs and you get the traditional ways in which data is presented, whether that's kind of, in graphs or grids or pie charts and things like that. Now, one of the things that GIS is a way in which you can present data in a much more appropriate format by actually presenting the data in the exact location where it's being collected. So if you can just give us a few minutes, I will try and explain this and make it a little bit more kind of appropriate and try to make you understand this a little bit more. So on the screen here, some of you might have used this website. It's quite an interesting one to go on if you haven't. It's called police.uk. And one of the things that the police do, I don't know if they have to, but they do it in the UK. They document, they log all of the crimes that are recorded in any given place. And you can type in, again, any place in the country on that kind of search tab at the top there, and it will tell you the crime statistics for the area that you've selected. So Southwold actually falls under the bracket of Halesworth. Halesworth is our kind of next nearest town, really. So if you type in Southwold, it comes up with the Halesworth results. So this is a kind of a summary snapshot of Southwold's crime results taken over the previous 12 months. And you can see we've got a grid there on the right-hand side showing the total number of crimes. We've got a few pie charts. We've got a kind of a line chart going on as well. Now that's fairly interesting, I suppose. But what it doesn't really do is it doesn't tell us where the problem is, because it's just under this broad umbrella of Halesworth. So actually, what would be much better with that data is to know where those crimes have happened. So we could pick out things like crime hotspots or areas where the crime is almost non-existent. Maybe if you're moving house, that would be quite interesting to know. So one of the things that you're able to do on this website is you're able to click on a tab that says Crime Map, which is in the middle of that left-hand section of information. So if you click on that crime map, you then get a page that looks like this. And that's zoomed into this Halesworth region, I suppose. And where the number 29 is, that represents Halesworth town. And you can see in the small little villages around Halesworth that the crime isn't particularly a problem, with only 1 or 2 in certain places, 5 and 4 in other places. Southwold had recorded 17 crimes in January 2022. So you can actually zoom in a bit further. You can kind of click on the individual villages and towns within that zone. I did that for Southwold. That's what's now above my head up here. And you can see that actually there were only 4 crimes that happened in Southwold during that month. And it's actually the ghetto of Raiden, the nearby suburb where the streets are pretty mean, which you want to avoid. So there's more of an issue of crime in Raiden. Still probably not a massive problem of crime, I wouldn't have thought. And only 4 in Southwold. Again, you could zoom in even further if you wanted to get a breakdown of the exact streets those crimes happened. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because actually, by mapping this data, it makes it much more relevant and much better and more useful than just putting it into a pie chart or into a grid. So if there's any possibility that you could map some of your data that you collect in Southwold and present it in a map format, that's going to blow the minds of the examiners. They're going to love that. They're going to say, wow, this person's ahead of the game. They're actually making their own GIS. Now, it's pretty easy to do, actually. So you can really impress examiners by making your own GIS, by following the next instructions that I'm going to give you, and then thinking about what methods that you're doing and what ones were practically suitable presenting your data in this kind of format. First thing that you need to do is you need to work out, if you have got a smartphone, you need to work out on your smartphone how you go about collecting your latitude and longitude coordinates. I'm going to try and hold this up and see if we can do this actually while you're there. You might get to some face ID. Doesn't recognise it. That's because I've had a haircut. Now, on your phone, you'll probably find that on there, if you've got an iPhone at least, there is actually a compass app. Most of you have this already on your phone, and on the compass app down here are your latitude and longitude. So your latitude is the 52 point something number, and the longitude is the other one, 1 point something number. So you've actually got an app that tells you straight away. Now, if you haven't got that app, or if you've got an Android, for instance, you'll definitely still be able to get your latitude and longitude off your phone, but there might be a number of different ways in which you choose to do it. So you can actually get it off Google Maps by dropping a pin on Google Maps, but it might be a little bit different depending on what model of phone that you have. But that's the key bit of information that you need to have. If you get your latitude and longitude, it will enable you to actually map the data that you collect in that particular place to where you've actually gathered it. Ultimately, this will enable you to produce maps that look like this. So these are maps that have been used or been created using something called Arcgis Online, which is a free website which you can use. And essentially what you do is you import the data that you've got into this website, and it presents your data in the exact location that you gathered it from. So on the left-hand side there's a holiday home map. So one of the students in the past went to different parts of Southwold, and they worked out the proportion of holiday homes on each street. And the bubbles there, those orange bubbles, represent how much, so what percentage of houses within each street was classed as a holiday home. Also got the gentrification map, which I spoke about in a human fieldwork video previously, and also that one in the middle of the screen there, that's showing the varying velocity or strength of longshore drift at different points along Southwold shore. So it's a really nice way of presenting that longshore drift. So this is what you need to visit if you're interested in making a GIS map. It's a website called Arcgis. You can just type it into Google. It's the first result that you get, or that's the simple email, simple website address at the top, arcgis.com. What I would suggest, probably not supposed to say this, but I actually wouldn't necessarily suggest that you sign up to this and you sign in. Kind of adds an extra layer of complexity where you need to create a password and an account. You can actually access what you need to by not creating an account. So kind of ignore that blue button in the middle and just go up to the bit on the top toolbar where it says map. And if you click on that, it takes you to a screen that looks like this. And at this stage, this is just an empty map of the UK with just a few cities labelled on it. So what we want to do is we want to feed that map with the data that we've collected in Southwold. So this is how we do it. Using Google Forms, or probably easiest, Excel, what I'd suggest you do is you open up a new database or spreadsheet, and you add in your data into this spreadsheet. Now you need to have it in the order that it is here shown. So your first column should just be labelled latitude, your second column should be labelled longitude, and the third column is whatever it is that you've been counting or surveying. That might be number of waves, it might be number of pedestrians, it could be the distance that the orange has drifted, it could be your total property quality survey score, it could be any kind of numerical data that you put into that third column. In the first and second column, then, you need to make sure that you're adding your latitude and longitude. You actually don't need as many decimal points as are shown there. I think normally 4 is plenty. You don't need to do anything jazzy with kind of the fonts or the style or the colours on this spreadsheet. You can be the most boring spreadsheet ever. But when you save it, one of the things that you have to make sure that you do when you save it is you save it as something called a CSV file. That's the version or the format the website needs you to save your spreadsheet in for it to be kind of compatible. So it's called a CSV file. So when you go to save as, you just need to kind of scroll down and make sure that you've saved it in the correct version. In my example, I've saved that somewhere where it's really obvious. So on my desktop there, I saved that file, and you can see it there on the left-hand side of the screen, just hovering over the horizon. That's my data. So what I've got there is my data stored and saved in a CSV file. I'm going to pull back up my Arcgis web page. There it is. And then literally all you do is you drag and drop that file onto the map, and you basically wait for the magic to happen. And what will happen is automatically it will populate your map with the data that you've given to it. So initially it will come up on this kind of default base map, and it will come up with these default colors with these kind of orange circular proportional symbols. Now you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there's a number of different functions and options. You can play around with the types of map that you're producing, the colors, the transparency of the blobs that you're using, the shapes of the blobs as well. You can also play around with the base maps. You can change it so it's kind of like more of a Google Street View. And then ultimately, when you're happy with what you've produced, you could actually just screenshot that, copy and paste it into a Word document. And that is then what has enabled us and students in the past to make bits of homemade GIS that look like this, that look really engaging, really colourful, which geography teachers obviously like, and just tick off that box of a kind of a high-level piece of data presentation. So I suggest that pretty much all of you should be able to do that. There are probably better step-by-step guides as to how to use Arcgis, but you don't need to get into the overly complex levels of understanding of it. It's just essentially the basics of how do you make a basic map on Arcgis that you need to know about. We've got a help sheet that we can give you, and perhaps when you come to Southwold, we can talk through it a bit further. But the reason that I'm talking about it at this stage is because what you might want to think in advance of your trip is, what methods am I doing that would actually lend themselves to being presented in this GIS format? And that might kind of influence where you get your data from and where it is that you kind of, the sites that you visit in Southwold. All right, almost done, I think. Almost the final slide. There are 10 things that I would expect or encourage you to do before your visit. We've kind of done the introduction, really. You've been introduced to what the NEA is. You've been introduced to the human and physical methods that you can complete in Southwold, and also the human and physical issues that we have in Southwold. And we've also just considered then how you would go about designing your fieldwork days when you come to Southwold. So just to kind of recap, really, these are the things that I would suggest that you do, perhaps even in this order, before you come to Southwold on your visit. Your first challenge is to watch either video 2 or 3, and having watched those videos, decide on the main issue that you want to choose to investigate. So what is the main issue that your study is going to be based upon? What I'd then suggest that you do, that's kind of probably in the wrong order, what I'd then suggest that you do is a bit of research actually on that issue. So rather than plunging straight in and coming out of a title straight away, what I'd suggest you do, if you're doing a study on coastal management or gentrification or decline of the high street or maybe changing places, do a bit more research into that issue to gain a bit of a wider contextual knowledge about it. So, for instance, if you're doing a study on second homes or gentrification, maybe look into that issue and how that's affected other parts of the country already. Places like Devon and Cornwall are particularly influenced by second home ownership. So you can gain a little bit more understanding about that issue before, thirdly, you then develop and choose your title or your aim, because your title or your aim may well come from the research that you've done into your issue and that kind of greater understanding that you've developed. It might be that based on what you've learned about Devon and Cornwall, that you actually ask a similar question about the impact of second home ownership in Southwold. Is it affecting Southwold in the same way that it's affecting other places that you've read about? So developing a title or an aim is something that I'd perhaps do after you've done a bit more research into your issue. And as I mentioned at the time, this normally works best if you set it as a question. So it's investigating a particular aspect of the issue that you've selected. Again, this isn't new to you, but once you have developed your title or your aim, we would suggest that you divide that up into 3 supporting sub-questions, which each in turn are relevant to your title and help you answer what it is that you're aiming to do. And then 5th, on this initial stage of planning, again, it's not new to you this, but we would suggest that between maybe 5, 6 or 7 methods overall that you choose to investigate while you're in Southwold. So try to select and choose maybe 2 methods that are relevant to each of your sub-questions, which would give you in total maybe 5 or 6 different methods of primary data that you're intending to do while you're here. Most students that come to Southwold will have at least 5 different methods of primary data collection that they're intending to gather during their visit. It doesn't have to be perfectly balanced. It could be that you do 3 for one sub-question and 1 for the other, but in total, you don't want to just rely on 1 or 2 methods of data collection only. There should be a variety of them. And as I said at the time, perhaps a mixture of quantitative and qualitative as well. So at that stage, you'll probably be able to complete most of that page on the left there, which is, again, kind of a simpler version of what's called the proposal form. And it might well be that at this stage you're having conversations with your teacher about your intentions, and you're still kind of thrashing out your ideas a little bit, but ultimately they'll kind of give you the green light to say, yeah, sounds as if that's a good study, and if you can justify what you're doing, it shouldn't be a problem. Once you've got the green light to your investigation, then you need to take on the second stage of your planning, and this is where you're actually planning for your fieldwork day. So initially then, what I'd suggest you do is you look at all of those methods that you're intending to do, and you actually almost write up a methodology for each of those things that you're going to be doing. And this is almost a little bit like a recipe, really. It's like a step-by-step guide for what it is exactly that you're going to do in terms of completing each of those methods, how you're going to do it, what equipment you're going to use, how long you're going to survey for, etc. That's what's known as your methodology. So you'll want to be clear on that before you come. There's no good really you kind of coming thinking that you're going to do an orange drift test, but actually having no idea how long you're going to time for, what equipment you're going to use, and where you're going to do it. So those are going to be your decisions that you'll need to prepare and think about before your visit. Secondly, we've spoken about this in this video. What is your sampling strategy to ensure that you get fair and good representative data? So where are you going to survey? What techniques are you going to use? How are you going to divide up Southwold seafront or Southwold town to make sure that you get a representative amount of data to fairly represent the bigger picture? How are you going to make sure that you're speaking to enough locals or tourists or, you know, people of different ages? So what is going to be your sampling plan to make sure that you're getting good data? So that, again, is something that you're going to need to consider. Thirdly, this should be fairly straightforward. What equipment will you need? For most of you that are doing human studies, you won't necessarily probably need any specialist equipment. We can provide you with things like clipboards, obviously, but you probably won't need too much specialist equipment. Most of you doing coastal studies will obviously need to collect a fair bit more from us. We've got pretty much most things, but if there's anything particularly kind of niche or bespoke that you think we may not have, ask your teacher and they can just drop us an email and just double check that we've got those things that you might be intending to use. But pretty much most things I can think of, we've got in our cupboards that we're happy to dish out to you at the start of your course. But you'll need to obviously be aware of what things you need to ask for when you arrive. Fourth on this list, this is something that will be up to you. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece this at all, but when you come, you need to have your own data collection booklet. Now that could literally just be in the format of a notepad. It could literally have been drawn, hand drawn. It doesn't have to be printed. It's going to be totally designed by you. But how are you going to collect your data? Are you going to use, for instance, your phone? I haven't mentioned this. I didn't want to plug it too much, but there is an app called Joggit, which is a data collection app. I can just show you that here. So some students choose to use Joggit for gathering some of their data. Others will use things like a voice recorder, or use things like the Decibel app on their phone. But most students will use a kind of a combination of two and will still write a lot of their things manually down on paper. So think about how you might design data collection grids and make sure, obviously, that you bring that with you. Finally, having considered all of these things, it's then down to you, really, when you get here, to have your own plan for the day or the days. And that is what's called your itinerary. So your teacher probably, once you've got settled into Southwold, you've picked up your equipment, they'll say to you, right, where are you going to first? And that's going to be your decision. So I would almost suggest that you create a fairly rough itinerary. What are you going to do in the morning? What are you going to do in the afternoon? What things are you going to repeat in the afternoon? What streets do you need to go into the morning? So making sure that you're making the best use of your time, essentially. So creating and planning your itinerary before you come, I think, would definitely be a good idea. And that's it. Okay, so depending on where we're going to host you in Southwold, this is our main NEA teaching classroom in Southwold Arts Centre, but we also work, as I mentioned earlier, in the United Reformed Church in the town. So there'll be a couple of different venues potentially, but we will be, regardless, somewhere in Southwold that we will welcome you into. And the next time that you have to hear my voice won't be on the screen, and it will be in person. So apologies about all of the droning on that I've done over the last few hours, but hopefully now you feel in a better position, that you know Southwold better, you've got inspiration and ideas for what your fieldwork could be on, and you're in a position to kind of get cracking. And as I say, if you've got any queries about the feasibility of your fieldwork, then ask your teacher. If they're unable to help you, they can email me directly, and I'll get back to you as quickly as possible. And I will look forward to seeing you in sunny Suffolk. All the best.